This presentation is over Alfred Crosby's work, Ecological Imperialism. The study very much coincides with the topic of the course Transatlantic History. His study is very thorough and quite lengthy, so what I am presenting is an overview of some of the major contributions that are derived from this study, especially the ones that add the most content to the historiography of transatlanticism. Crosby begins by introducing Pangaea and how its breakup 200 million years ago sets the stage for the series of events that follow, most importantly, the isolation of particular regions. Crosby places great emphasis on the concept of isolation. It is a result of geographical isolation that different flora and fauna appear in dissimilar regions. This is why, when he expands on human agency, it all depends on where people are located geographically. Crosby makes a point to establish the development of the human brain, leading to more specialized activities such as agriculture and the domestication of animals. All of this adds together, complements the rise of culture, which for Crosby is impossible without formalized agricultural and domestication of animals. The first method Crosby uses to demonstrate the effects of isolation on the capability to effectively colonize particular areas are in the cases of the Norse and the Crusaders. The Norse made several attempts to colonize lands in the North Atlantic, but ultimately fell short. The Norse took divergent paths. Some ventured toward the British Isles, others turned east towards the North Atlantic. Proximity plays a major role in the decisions made by the Norse. Crosby associates the lack of Norsemen's ability to successfully colonize areas of North America because they were very limited in numbers when they took long-distance voyages, as well as their proximity to their supply routes. They did have advantages over other groups, but their disadvantages were much larger. The failure of the Norse in this context is the missing genocidal potential of their presence. They had no biological agent to destroy the indigenous population. Crosby uses this point to illustrate how several factors needed to align in order for a successful colonization campaign, not just the drive to undertake the voyage. Smallpox would eventually come to the Norse and devastate their population, so much so that by the 14th century they made no more attempts at North Atlantic colonization. In contrast, the Crusaders undertook a campaign in an environment that they had interaction with for centuries. They did not have to deal with the same issues that the Norse did, by crossing a foreign body of water or confronting a foreign group of people. Another advantage of the Crusaders was their ability to successfully establish 4 colonies: Edessa, Tripoli, Antioch, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. However great their numbers may have been, their factors still compounded, and the differences between them and the native groups was why long-term attempts eventually failed. Crosby's next chapter centers on what he calls the Fortunate Isles. In this section, Crosby focuses on the European 14th century discovery of the Madeira and the Azores and the Canaries, and the role they performed for Europeans in demonstrating the potential success for transferring old world environments to newly discovered places. Crosby adds how these 3 archipelagos of the Eastern Atlantic were the laboratories, the pilot programs for the new European imperialisms, and the lessons learned there would crucially influence world history for centuries to come. The most important lesson drawn from this experience was that Europeans and their plants and animals could do quite well where they had never existed before. This is where ecological imperialism reveals itself, and it is upon this understanding that Europeans ventured to other places, having devastating effects on indigenous populations and ecologies. Major developments in the ability of Europeans to reach distant lands depended upon their ability to harness the power of wind. This was a product of adapting innovations and navigations from various places, such as the Chinese. This demonstrates the interconnectivity of the period regarding the sharing of technological innovations. Regarding long-distance voyages for colonizations was purely European. Crosby discusses how the actual ships, owners, bankers, interested monarchs and noblemen, cartographers, mathematicians, navigators, and astronomers were all European. Also in this section, we see the rise in prominence of the Portuguese marinheiros and how their expertise of wind currents enabled discovery. By deciphering the winds and harnessing their power, it opened up an opportunity for a greater flow of trade. This is where merchants come in and came to dominate the seas, introducing isolated regions and I quote, "Now to implement, consolidate, build empires, and in general, make money from what the Marineros had learned. That meant commerce, for which round trips across oceans would be necessary." End quote. Crosby calls this process of the Age of Discovery as the closing of the seams of Pangaea. Crosby next turns to why some early attempts by Europeans in colonizing or incorporating other regions into their systems failed. Crosby discusses 3 tropic zones that drew European imperialists: the American lowlands, the African lowlands, and the Caribbean. Crosby adds how Europeans were often obliged to adopt local crops, such as maize and sweet potatoes, which of course served the Europeans no better than they served the other races. Disease organisms as well, most of which were apparently from the Old World, took a heavy toll among native populations, as is in the case of Amerindians in the tropics, eliminating most of them in the lowlands and the islands, opening up these areas for white settlement. But specifically, African pathogens treated the whites almost as severely as the Amerindians with Old World pathogen exposure, crippling their colonial enterprises. Crosby adds that between 1793 and 1796, the British Army in the Caribbean theater lost about 80,000 men, over half of them to yellow fever alone. The long-term effects also dislocated inhabitants from various regions to fill the declining labor force able to be exploited by Europeans. Disease was the most important factor dictating how Americans would be a land racial mixture. Crosby states, Amerindians melted away, and European immigrants survived with difficulty, so the entrepreneurs of Atlantic commerce brought millions of Africans to replace Amerindian labor in the humid American tropics. This fits directly into the transatlantic context throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, concerning the forced migration of African slaves to various colonized regions. As established, the opportunity for success depends upon features such as limited population pool and the ability to transplant European livestock and agriculture while avoiding indigenous diseases that restricted these attempts. The next section of text covers 3 general kinds of life forms that often passed over the seams of Pangaea and usually prospered in the colonies, often without help and sometimes even despite European actions. These include weeds, animals, and pathogens. Weeds, as Crosby calls them, the botanical Midas, establishes a precedence for the introduction of Old World plants and the impact it had on indigenous natural environments and altering the landscape. Europeans often exhausted the resources of these newly discovered places. This included the destructions of forest for timber and fuel, clearing places for new initiatives. Crosby adds that wherever European or half-breed pioneer threw up his little hut, mallows and thistles such sprang up, even if there were no such plants for 30 leagues. Crosby presents the transformative impact of the wild artichoke. He adds, the wild artichoke, the cardo de Castilla, common in Buenos Aires in 1749, continued to spread, and when Charles Darwin visited this part of the world 80 years later, he found it in Argentina and Chile, and so luxuriant in Uruguay that it rendered hundreds of square miles impenetrable by horse or man. These colonizing plants, weeds, had a regenerative impact as well on the native flora that was depleted because of the presence of herd animals and overclearing. Weeds, as Crosby states, are the Red Cross of the plant world. They deal with ecological emergencies. Domesticated animals comprise another crucial component to colonizing success, as more groups of travelers begin to venture outward. It was part of the familiarization process of constructing a semblance of Old World environments. Adaptable animals were very effective at initiating the change. This point is highlighted with differences between Aboriginal Australia and the Amerindians, reinforcing his argument regarding the impact of regional isolation. Crosby notes how the Australian Aborigines had only one domesticated animal, the dingo. The Amerindians also had dogs, llamas, alpacas, guinea pigs, and several kinds of fowl, but that was all. These animals, Crosby concludes, were all inferior to the domesticated animals of the Old World in the efficiency of self-replicating animals such as horses, cattle, pigs, goats, and sheep, each of which assisted in altering the environment at a rapid pace. Here Crosby uses the example of the pig to illustrate the self-replicating impact on indigenous landscapes, as well as the practical purpose it served for voyagers. Crosby adds, pigs were the favorite choice of explorers, pirates, whalers, and sealers for seeding remote islands to assure a supply of meat for the next set of transient Europeans or Neo-Europeans to come along. The unintentional animal transfers had a lasting and devastating impact as well. Rats, for example, were stowaways that found their access through voyages of Europeans, as Crosby states, crossing the seas of Pangaea without invitation. Jamestown, for example, immigrant rats almost extinguished Jamestown, Virginia in 1609, when the colony was barely 2 years old. The settlers there found that many of their stores of food had been consumed by the many thousands of rats from the English ships. This story replicates itself in other places frequented and settled by Europeans. The next section confronts the dominance of Old World infections, the presence and effects of which is indicated as early as Columbus. The isolation from the indigenous of the Americas and Australia from Old World germs prior to the last few hundred years was nearly absolute. Crosby here focuses on the impact of smallpox. The example he uses is one of the Spanish, noting how the disease exterminated a large fraction of the Aztecs and cleared a path for the aliens to the heart of Tenochtitlan and to the founding of New Spain. The visual appearance of smallpox was so devastating that it created chaos in indigenous populations. Crosby adds, its effects are terrifying. The fever and pain, the swift appearance of pustules that sometimes destroy the skin and transform the victim into a gory horror. The healthy members of society often fled from the diseased, inadvertently spreading smallpox to other regions as a product of the lengthy incubation period. The New World, however, could offer no comparative transfer back to Europe other than venereal syphilis, but it never had the same disastrous effect on Old World populations. Crosby adds that the evenness of the exchange operated to the overwhelming advantage of European invaders. The next section focuses on New Zealand and the Maori. New Zealand represents a microcosm of the long-term impacts of ecological imperialism because of the well-documented European presence. This section is most important for establishing that Europeanization was not an inevitable process, and that at least 3 requirements had to be met before the process could become self-sustaining and irreversible. First, something was needed to attract Europeans, and thus their transferable organisms. Second, proximity. It must be a region close enough to contact. Third, something to get the indigenous to work for the Europeans. These types of transfers and ecological takeovers came to a head in New Zealand with the use of the Maori in various European operations, including whale and seal hunting. Crosby's last section is titled Explanations and introduces the term portmanteau biota, which is his overarching term for Europeans and the organisms they introduced deliberately and inadvertently into foreign environments. Crosby, through his study, reinserts human agency to the narrative, namely how animals, plants, and disease could not alone make the journey. This is revealed through the different points of transfer that occur as a product of human exploration and expansion. However, once the transfer was initiated, control was often lost, and these once isolated regions became familiarized with Old World flora and fauna. So in this context, what does Europeanized mean? For Crosby, it refers to a condition of continual disruption. Quote, of plowed fields, raised forests, overgrazed pastures, and burned prairies, of deserted villages and expanding cities, of humans, animals, plants, and microlife that have evolved separately, suddenly coming into intimate contact. The success of the portmanteau biota and of its dominant member, the European human, was a team effort by organisms that had evolved in conflict and cooperation over a long time. In conclusion, Crosby's source material is extensive. His use of maps indicate the transatlantic nature to this study. Beginning with Norse movement, the Atlantic provided an expansive space where imperial and colonizing dynamics became formalized. The Atlantic is an arena of focus for this study, truly demonstrating through different ecological environments that transfers are not just intellectual or ideological, even if those forces drive exploration. There are various factors that had to work in tandem in order to reconstruct a space prime for European settlement. This is how Crosby's study is effectively one of ecological imperialism.